Hey everyone, welcome back to the Planting Roots podcast. I'm Stephen Partain, one of the pastors of Grace Community Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. On today's episode, we're continuing to walk through the prophet Isaiah. Today we'll be in chapter 5 and looking at a poem, a parable that Isaiah tells to make a point to the people of Israel. And so it's important to remember that these first 5 chapters, what we're seeing is a preface really to the rest of the book. Isaiah is taking the first 5 chapters and he's making a strong point that will set the tone for what's to come. We've seen that God wants his people to be living in light with the revelation he's given them, to not be hypocritical, and to be those type of people that recognize that when God calls them to be righteous, they live in righteousness. And if they don't, then God will bring judgment on his people. So today in Isaiah chapter 5, we see a little bit different of a chapter than before. We see a poem written by Isaiah. And so starting in verse 1, we read the following. I'm going to sing a song for my friend, my love song about his vineyard. My friend had a vineyard on a fertile ridge. He dug it and stoned it and planted it with choice vine. He built a tower in the middle of it and also hewed a press in it. He looked for it to produce grapes, but it produced bad grapes. So now, population of Jerusalem, people of Judah, decide, will you, between me and my vineyard? What more was there to do for my vineyard that I did not do in it? Why, when I looked for it to produce grapes, did it produce bad grapes? So the question is, what is Isaiah talking about here? What is the point that he is making? Well, he's talking about this vineyard, right? This vineyard is very important, and the vineyard represents Judah, represents the people of Israel. And so when he's talking about this vineyard, he's saying that he has invested in his people, that God has taught the people of Israel. He has given them his law. He has shown up when he was supposed to show up. He has done his part, and yet they are not living lives that honor God. We see this over and over in these first few chapters, that God has done his part, but the people are not doing theirs. In fact, even here we see that he is looking for it to produce grapes, but we see bad grapes coming from there. So God is investing, God is cultivating, God is doing the work that he should be, but the fruit is not being produced. Well, what is the issue here? The issue is that God's people are not willing to put their money where their mouth is. They're not willing to live lives of righteousness and of honor. As we keep walking down, we get to verse 7. It says, because the house of Israel is the vineyard of Yahweh armies, the people of Judah are the planting in which he delighted. He looked for the exercise of authority, but there blood pouring out for faithfulness, but there a cry. So what's happening here? What is the point that he's making? Is that he wanted to see a people that would produce justice and righteousness. That he would see that God had put his stamp on them. They were producing the things that God had called them to. But instead they were producing the exact opposite. The bloodshed that came from that, the blood pouring out, the faithlessness, the lack of honoring God is what came from this vineyard. And God is going to deal with that. God is not going to allow that to stand. He can't allow that to stand because they are his people. We're talking about a nation that's turned their back on who God's called them to be. People that should be living in line with the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Yahweh, really, in the Old Testament. We see that they're not living up to that standard. As we keep walking on, even later on in verse 20, we read the following. Hey, people who say about evil good and about good evil, who make darkness into light and light into darkness, who make bitter into sweet and sweet into bitter. We're seeing people that have not just turned their backs on what God has taught, but actually are saying the opposite of what God has said. You can see why the prophet is so distressed at the people of Israel. They're not fulfilling their call, but in fact, they're actually twisting the words and the teachings of God. And so for us, people that read this prophet and want to apply it to our lives, we have to ask the question, am I producing fruits of righteousness and of justice in my life? And also when it comes down to it, am I calling good good or am I calling evil good? It's a good question for all of us as we keep walking through this prophet. Thanks for being a part of the Planting Roots podcast and walking with us through Isaiah. We look forward to seeing you again later on this week.